I bring you very warm greetings from the Republic of Sierra Leone, the government and the people, and from the 12 nations of ECOWAS, whose collective voice I am honored to carry to this platform today. Before I proceed, let me thank the Oxford Africa Society for inviting me back for a second consecutive year. To be welcomed once to an institution like this is an honor. But to be invited again signals that the conversation is getting serious and interesting. And we intend to keep it at that. Madam President, last year, standing at the same platform, I spoke about the African agency. I spoke about our duty, collectively and individually, to move away from being defined by external narratives towards becoming the primary authors of our own story, the authentic African story. That argument, ladies and gentlemen, remains valid. And so this year, I want to press it further. Agency is necessary, but not sufficient. A people may recover their voice and still fail to secure their future. A continent may assert itself and still remain vulnerable if that assertion is not anchored in institutions, legitimacy, resilience, and systems that can endure pressure. Last year, we asked whether Africa could define itself. This year, we must ask something harder. Can what we define endure? Can it survive shocks and disruptions? Can it survive political strains, demographic pressure, climate stress, and technological upheavals? Can it survive the fracturing of old alliances? That is the work of anchoring. If agency is authorship, then anchoring is durability. If agency is to find a voice, anchoring is what ensures that voice is not easily silenced. Madam President, I stand before you today wearing two mantles as President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. And as President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, I speak from lived experience of a country that has been tested by war, epidemic, institutional fragility, economic strain, climate pressure, and which continues step by step to reform itself and to rebuild at the same time. As chairman of ECOWAS, Authority of Heads of State and Government, I speak from the vantage point of a region confronting some of the most complex political, security, economic challenges we have seen in recent decades. From both positions, the conclusion is the same. Africa's moment is not something we are waiting for. It is something we are already living. The question is whether we are prepared to sustain it and deepen it. Sustaining it requires that we must first understand the nature of the forces working against it. Madam President, the age of disruption is sometimes described as though it were made up of several separate crises. But that is not how disruption is experienced on the ground for those of us living through it. across our continent, time and again, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, from the Great Lakes to the Mano River Union, we have seen this clearly. A drought does not stay as a drought. It becomes food crisis. Food crisis becomes revenue crisis, and revenue crisis becomes a security crisis. What begins in a farmer's field ends up in the streets of the capital and spills over into neighboring countries' border posts. Africa's disruption arrive together. So if we make the mistake and analyze it separately, we will solve them poorly and wrongly. This is why grounded, game-changing leadership must begin by seeing disruption as a system of intersecting challenges and not as a sequence of isolated events. And this is why no African state can secure itself in isolation. In this age of disruption, ladies and gentlemen, practical statecraft means treating institutional order, constitutional order, economic resilience, security cooperation, climate adaptation, youth opportunity, and technological agency as public goods. These are the anchors that will hold us steady when disruption occurs. Africa will be anchored only if it does not compromise the quality of its leadership. I know this both as a regional proposition and as a national one. So, Madam President, there are two presidents in here, ladies and gentlemen. Let me bring this closer to experience. Sierra Leone understands disruption, not from the textbook, but from our lived reality. We have endured a conflict that tested the very fabric of our nation. We have faced epidemics that exposed the weaknesses in our system, but also revealed the strength of our communities. We have absorbed economic shocks that reminded us how vulnerable dependency can make us. And today, we are dealing with climate pressures that affect farmers, fisher folks, and communities across our country. When I assumed office in 2018, Sierra Leone was still emerging from the Ebola crisis. Our public finances were under considerable strain. Confidence in institutions had to be rebuilt. Expectations were high, but the margin for error was this thin, small. It was not an easy position to inherit, and it was immediately compounded by COVID-19 less than 2 years into my first term. We've experienced shocks, setbacks, difficult decisions, and moments where progress felt slower than we would have wished. But what has mattered most is that we, as a government, chose a new direction, and we remained consistent. We made deliberate choices to prioritize people over patronage, to invest in systems rather than in symbols, to pursue long-term transformation even when short-term alternatives seemed more convenient. Last year, here, I outlined 5 national key priorities. what we have called our game changer initiatives in Sierra Leone. One is our free quality education program, which has expanded access to schooling for millions of children who would have otherwise been excluded, especially our girls. Our agricultural reforms under the Feed Salon program is steadily strengthening domestic production and reducing reliance on imports. These are not perfect outcomes, ladies and gentlemen, but they are meaningful ones, confirming that the new direction is the right direction to go. They show that when policy is sustained and when aligned with national priorities, progress becomes tangible. And perhaps most importantly, they restore belief and trust in the government. I have seen in the eyes of young Sierra Leoneans something that gives me confidence. I see the impatience for opportunity, not the fear of disruption. But Sierra Leone's story, with all its difficulty and progress, is part of a larger regional story. The West African story, if you want to, and maybe the African story. Across West Africa, we are seeing the pressures and the consequences of leadership decisions playing out in real time. We must seek or speak about these honestly, ladies and gentlemen, if we are going to make progress. Coups and unconstitutional changes of government are not abstract developments for us in West Africa. They are actually signals of systems under strain, of trust that has eroded, and of expectations that have not been met by the government, breaking of the social contract. ECOWAS has acted as it should to defend constitutional order. That principle is non-negotiable. But we must also recognize that stability cannot be enforced indefinitely without legitimacy. Sanctions may create pressure in the short term, but it cannot create trust or rebuild institutions. Diplomacy can open the space for discussion and dialogue, but it cannot substitute for good governance that delivers. It is important, therefore, for us leaders to understand that democracy goes beyond, far beyond elections. To be meaningful, democracy must work in substance. When citizens do not feel heard, when institutions fail to function, people begin to question the system itself. So our responsibility is not only to defend democracy, but to make it mean something in the daily lives of our citizens. That work cannot be outsourced or delayed again. Our people are impatient. Neither is it confined to just a single border, one country. So, Madam President, we must also be honest about the regional and continent-wide consequences of political and economic instability. Conflicts do not stop at the customs post because they do not pay duty anyway. They move through border communities, trade corridors, armed flows, extremist networks, displacement routes, and disrupted local economies or communities. A stable country surrounded by instability cannot indefinitely remain untouched by what is happening around it. Regional leadership matters, so acutely because if neighboring states are weak, each state becomes more vulnerable. If neighboring states are resilient, each state becomes more secure. Many of our borders did not erase the older reality beneath them. Communities linked by language, trade, marriage, culture, and shared history. That is why regional cooperation is not an optional idea, but a survival strategy. That shared reality extends most visibly to how people move and why. But Madam President, all too often, migration is discussed as though its primary meaning were movement towards Europe or North America. That is not the full picture. Much of Africa's displacement and migration burden is born within Africa itself. Within states, across neighboring borders, and inside regional systems already under serious strain. In fact, we are managing the largest intracontinental displacement burden in the world, mostly unrecognized, without adequate acknowledgement, and mostly without the commensurate resources. That is the conversation we should be having. The answer to displacement and economic migration cannot be insulated. Collective blame or the expulsion of vulnerable people is not the solution. Those responses may only satisfy anger for the moment, but they do not resolve the conflict. They do not create the jobs for our young people, nor do they restore order or repair failures of governance. They deepen fracture on the continent whose security and prosperity are closely shared. African solutions must therefore be integrative before they are exclusionary. Which brings me to the force that we define Africa's trajectory more than any other: the sheer scale and energy of our youth. Madam President, we cannot talk about disruption without speaking about demography. Africa is the world's youngest continent, and by 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. A continent this young cannot be governed with old assumptions, slow institutions, and economies that fail to create opportunity at scale. If politics do not adapt to demographic reality, frustration will outrun reforms. If education systems expand without markets widening, impatience will deepen. And if democratic systems do not create meaningful pathways for participation, trust will continue to erode among those who who've been asked to wait for the longest for their own dignity. Game-changing leadership must be able to convert all of these into education, jobs, participation, mobility, and hope. That is how we can save our continent. This responsibility, Madam President, does not exist in isolation from the global reality. The world is changing, and Africa must engage it with clarity. We are entering a multipolar era where influence is distributed and alliances are very, very fluid. Africa is no longer peripheral to all of these dynamics. We are central to them. We must approach them with confidence. African strategic autonomy is not about rejecting the world. It is about engaging it on our own terms that reflect our interest. It is about choosing partnerships that build our capacity, not diminish it. That is self-respect, and the same principles apply to knowledge. Africa must contribute to shaping the frameworks which the world governs the world. It applies just as urgently to technology. And therefore, I come to AI. Artificial intelligence is already reshaping economies, governance, and society. Africa cannot afford to be a passive consumer of all of these systems. Right now, let me say this, the training data underpinning major AI systems contain almost no African language at any meaningful depth. The legal and regulatory frameworks being drafted in Brussels and Washington will govern how AI operates on this continent, our continent. We have no input. We are not meaningfully present in those rooms. If Africa arrives late to AI governance, others will write the term on our behalf. The issue for Africa is not whether to engage AI, but whether we will engage it as makers, rule shapers, and co-authors. We need a Pan-African AI governance framework driven by the African Union and supported by member states, built in partnership with institutions like this that will be equipped with teeth, timelines, and accountability. This requires investment, collaboration, and confidence. To the scholars here, the conversations that we define AI governance are happening right now. Africa is not there. Africa must be present in those rooms. And if those spaces are not easily accessible, it is incumbent upon us to create new rooms for Africa to be present in one. And this same principle applies with equal force to climate change. Madam President, climate change remains one of the strongest injustices of our time. Africa contributes the least to global emissions, yet bears a disproportionate burden of the consequences. Our response must be both principled and practical. We must continue to demand fairness in global climate finance. But we must also continue to build resilience and adapt. Because ultimately, anchoring Africa means ensuring that our own development is built on solid foundation that we can control. And we must be clear about who the future is for. Africa cannot be anchored without its women. And it cannot rise without its young people. Their participation is not optional. It is essential. Ladies and gentlemen, the leadership this movement requires should be practical. Grounded leadership stabilizes. Game-changing leadership transforms. Africa, in my view, needs both to stabilize and to transform. So what does anchoring Africa mean in practice? It means building states that citizens can trust. It means making democracy deliver and defend constitutional order with the same energy we use to defend it in principle. It means recognizing that regional stability is a shared responsibility. It means treating displacement, insecurity, climate change, demographic pressure, and economic fragility as intersecting realities, not isolated events. It means rejecting isolationism and xenophobia as policy, not merely as moral failures, but as strategic ones. It means a continent that speaks with clarity, acts with consistency, and understands that progress is not built in one moment, but over time and through decisions that accumulate into transformation. That transformation involves people in rooms like this. Madam President, let me end where I began. The Oxford African Society members. To you young Africans here, build where you stand. But stay connected to where you come from. Let your education make you more useful to Africa, not less connected to it. The innovation Africa needs will not only come from Silicon Valley or Shenzhen. It will come from people who understand world possibilities and also the continent's realities. You are those people. To the diaspora, you are not observers of the African story. You are actually characters in it. Bring your knowledge, your network, and commitment back into Africa. That is how we are going to make progress. That requires a conscious choice to remain connected, not to romanticize return, but to insist that your expertise stay in conversation with the continent that produced you, whether you are physically present or building bridges from abroad. The diaspora is not outside Africa's story. The diaspora is one of Africa's most powerful assets if it chooses to be. And to our partners, engage with Africa in the spirit of partnership and not prescription. And to institutions like the University of Oxford, if you want to take Africa seriously, do not merely interpret the continent. Make room for Africans to shape the terms of that interpretation itself. Last year, I said, Africa is watching. The world is listening. History is waiting. Today, I say, history is not waiting. It is unfolding right now in our decisions, in our institutions, and in what we choose to defend and change. Africa can anchor its own story. We are already doing that. What remains is leadership steady enough to hold the ground where stability is needed most. and bold enough to change where reform is overdue. I thank you all.